Hey, okay. Well, I'm going to cover a film today that is a bit controversial among us horror fans, and that is the 2010 remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, I don't think that the remake is a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, or that it's necessarily better than the original, so, let's get that right out of the way first off. I do, though, think that it stands as a film in its own right, stands up as a film in its own right, for reasons that I will explain. I guess the first thing to mention is the controversy surrounding the film. Obviously, anybody replacing Robert Englund as Freddy was going to have an almost impossible task. Englund is Freddy, and he's made the character his own. He gave Jackie Earle Haley his blessing, as far as I can tell, which was very decent of him. It in no way besmirches Englund's work, after all. And he says that he respects Haley as an actor. Now, some of this may have been said through metaphorical gritted teeth, but he could have been difficult about it, and he wasn't, which for me speaks to his character as both an actor and as a human, honestly. What I do find disappointing, though, is particularly Rooney Mara's view of the film and of the genre itself. Can't remember her exact words, but I think she basically said that people have to be crazy to like these sorts of films, or words to that effect. At the end of the day, though, I mean, she took the paycheck, and she got to play one of the most iconic characters in 80s horror. So I think her criticism of it is unwarranted and kind of ridiculous to some extent. And also, given how beloved the franchise is, I think she could have handled her misgivings more diplomatically. Also, some people have asked why, since they brought Nancy back, did they not bring back the other characters as well, like Tina or Glenn or etc. And I think the reason, honestly, is it's simple enough, really. In the original, Freddy versus Nancy is the central adversarial relationship. The filmmakers didn't need to bring back all the other characters by name, though Chris in the remake could be Christina or Tina, of course. They wanted their own take on it while anchoring the story around Nancy and Freddy, because in the first film, as I say, that was the main adversarial relationship, as I say. So they were kind of the hook for the remake, if you like, Freddy and Nancy, and all the other characters and events could be recreated to some extent. While the original characters were brilliant, of course, there's no getting away from it. It could have ended up looking like the filmmakers were trying to redo the original straight. So I understand why they chose to do what they did, but I think what was probably a mistake was to get rid of all the names of the characters, but to keep the characteristics of some of the characters. I think that seemed a little bit cheap, honestly. Okay, moving on to the story. I think it's an interesting take. Honestly, it's certainly more modern by making Freddy a molester rather than a murderer, and it evokes a different kind of disgust in the viewer, and in some ways does make him more sinister, I think. I mean, we've all got memories of Freddy, certainly from the latter films, becoming more humorous, I think, and this character certainly isn't that. I thought the idea that he might have been falsely accused is an interesting one as well, exploring the possibility of that, but it's never really taken seriously enough in a narrative sense for it to reach its full potential. I mean, you could, for example, have had more interplay between Freddy and the kids. him claiming his innocence, because he never really does. That's just an idea that the kids get. The evidence against him could have been examined, at least, or explained away, maybe, even. And then he would turn at the end, and it could have all sort of added to the manipulation. But of course, the film would have been longer, probably, so that was never going to work. There is the point, however, that there was no suggestion, at least no obvious suggestion in the original movie, that Freddy was a molester. That he was a murderer, but not that he was a molester in any way. And which is true, but murder doesn't need to have a molestation element to be a sexual crime, really. And in some of the later entries of the original series, there are suggestions that there could have been a partly sexual motivation for the killings. And personally, I liked the creepiness that Jackie Earle Haley brought to the character, going for a more quieter, more brooding sort of a take, rather than Englund's at times, as I say, more gleeful portrayal as the series went on. Even though he didn't start out like that. I mean, yes, there was glee to the character from the first movie, but it wasn't really comedy. It became more and more comedic as the series went on, I think, which, at least in my view, was a mistake. The one area, though, where this film does fall down is the special effects, at least in my opinion. The makeup effects are good, and are, I believe, enhanced by CGI to some extent. And they give Freddy a more realistic kind of menace. I mean, he looks more like a burn victim than a fantasy character, which worked in the original because of Englund's performance and the quality of the writing, etc. However, the big scene where he's in the wall, Freddy is in the wall above Nancy in her bedroom, which is so memorable, bordering on iconic, really, from the first film, is done particularly badly. As is the ending, unfortunately. I'm not going to give it away, so no spoilers. But it doesn't exactly end well for Nancy's mum, who's played by Connie Britton. Played quite well by Connie Britton, I have to say. And it's got none of the borderline comedic insanity of the original. That original ending was crazy, and it worked because of the tone of the rest of the film. But here, the end is just, well, frankly, it's just subpar CGI, at least by today's standards, which characterizes a lot of the effects in the film, really, which is unfortunate. I think they lent a bit heavy on CGI. And of course, why, a large part of why the original is so effective and memorable is that so much was done practically because it had to be. And obviously it worked great back then. But I would think it was cheaper to go with CGI for the remake, so that's what they did for a lot of it, unfortunately, which, it's unfortunate, I think, that they couldn't have done more practically. The one thing I do really like in the film, though, is the score. The rises it goes through, particularly in the title sequence, are very effective, I think. It evokes mystery and emotion rather than outright horror, though, which, I'm not sure whether it's the right score for, what is essentially a remake of a slasher movie, but then they were going for a different tone. I mean, it was a more dramatic tone, really, and the music reflects that quite well, I think. It's more mysterious and more tense and emotional. But, again, because that is the very reason the film ultimately doesn't work as well as the original, though, is because the tone is so different. The slower pace of the remake, it does land wheels up because of the comparison. But having said that, as I say, the music does do its job very well, I think. In summary, then, I think that we got what was probably the best movie it could have been, given the budget, the actors, and the tone they were going for. But it is flawed, and as I say, I think a big mistake was the tone, which focused at least as much on drama as the slasher elements, making for a different kind of horror that didn't really work as well as the original did for most people by comparison. In terms of its box office reception, I think Robert Englund was exactly right. It was too different to take, and it came out when the box set the originals was doing well. I can't remember if it would have been on DVD or Blu-ray, probably Blu-ray, and people just didn't want it at that time. However, I think that if you want to see a slower, quieter take on the story, this is worth checking out. I mean, as I said earlier, it does stand up. It does stand up as a film, I think, and as part of the series. I mean, it's kind of like what they've done with Star Trek. Now you've got the beta timeline. It's kind of it could be a alternate dimension type of thing. I don't know. But maybe that's something that they could explore as well. Some sort of dimensional aspect of the story, which would work, given that, I mean, it's about dreams and everything like that. However, what it doesn't have is the frenetic feel of the first one. There's not the same degree of energy to it. As I say, though, personally, I mean, I liked the slower pace and enjoyed the film for what it was. And I also think it's interesting in terms of what was happening in these kinds of horror movies at the time. Trying to put story into slasher movies when it doesn't really need to be there. I mean, an example of that would be Rob Zombie's take on Halloween in 2007, and then the sequel in 2009, which was, I prefer the 2009 film to the 2007 one. And, again, the box office reception of both suggesting that perhaps you don't need an in-depth background story on the villain to make an effective slasher movie. All you've got to have, really, is people being killed in gruesome and interesting ways, and possibly a bit of nudity, tits and violence, basically. It's a formula that seems to work in that genre. So, that was my review of the remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, and with all of the above being said, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and all that other good stuff, and I will speak to you soon. Cheers for watching, and bye for now.